The field of martial arts is a largely academic practice. It's about theory, application, and a bit of psychology. The practical science of how to put another man into the ground while he is trying to do the same to you. But all of these tangled mind games go completely out the window when you must defend yourself against something not human. To this day, humanity still finds itself vulnerable to the ravages of the animal kingdom. And the core of this comes from a primordial fear of monsters. Every civilization in history has created stories about monsters, and it is carved into the DNA of mankind to be afraid of the unknown. Which is why it's a very special occasion when a video game, especially a fighting game, puts that alien element into a player's hands. Today on this special Halloween episode of Style Select, we're tapping into the mind of the beast to understand what makes monster characters in fighting games so unique. At the risk of sounding unintentionally philosophical, we must first make the distinction. What counts as a monster? To simplify matters, we're not talking about morality monsters, even though I can definitely name a few. We are talking about characters who embody certain inhuman physical qualities. To that end, I've devised a gradient that visualizes where a character places based on how many steps away from humanity they are. On the lowest end of the scale are characters who are basically human but have bestial or primal behaviors. While there is perhaps something to say about the primordial, uninhibited human mind and the line that separates man from beast, this is not what we're here to talk about. A step up from that are humanoid monsters. These are your beastmen, your half-breeds, your lycanthropes, pretty much all of Bloody Roar. While they may have inhuman physical features, they still behave in somewhat predictable ways. A wolf is a wolf, a lizard is a lizard, and so on. Beastmen don't exist in real life, but we as humans have come to recognize what fangs and claws do. Predictably, at the middle of the gradient is the uncanny valley. Humanoid, but here I like to categorize characters who appear humanoid but whose bodies behave in unpredictable ways. This is typically where I'd place shapeshifters and characters with lots of transformations. You could file 90% of the cast of Darkstalkers here. It's at this part of the gradient where things start getting really interesting, where things start feeling well and truly monstrous. One step up from that are characters who are just straight up not human. At this point, all bets are off the table and nothing is logical anymore. While you could technically put actual animal characters in this bracket, I like to think more about characters whose bodies are so strange that it's near impossible to grasp that they even have something resembling a fighting style. At the very top of this gradient is Arakune from BlazBlue because he is a bag full of bees! For the purpose of discussion, I want to focus on the middle of the gradient going upwards. When it comes to designing monsters for video games, there's a lot of basic things that designers have to reimagine from the ground up, especially if they have inhuman anatomy. How they move, how they interact with the world, how they behave around a player, how they attack. But what makes fighting game monsters so interesting is that not only are those matters taken into consideration, you then have to turn it into a move list and put it in the player's hands. You ever play a game that lets you take control of an enemy with their entire move list intact? Or seen one of those Dark Souls mods that lets you play as bosses? It's a little like that, except balanced for player versus player. Part of how martial arts came to be is that humans found out how to utilize the natural weapons of their body to inflict damage to another person. Which is why monsters can be so interesting, because at some point a designer had to think of how a monster utilizes the natural weapons unique to their anatomy. This is true in most video games, of course, but in fighting games it becomes especially interesting because fighting game characters are expected to move in calculated and precise movements. Even the concept of a combo would be beyond the comprehension of most monsters. In a sense, fighting game monsters have to develop a martial art, using their bodies to form a repertoire of specialized attacks and combinations. You can find clear examples of this in Monster Hunter. The monsters that you fight all have extremely hazardous anatomical features that make them dangerous to hunt, but what makes them especially deadly is how each monster has learned to utilize their own bodies to its maximum potential. Let's take a basic example. Most monsters with tail-mounted weapons know how to swing their tail to attack, and most monsters with wings know how to use them to leap high into the air. but the Rathian has figured out how to use both in conjunction to perform a flying backflip tail strike. For a more extreme example, let's look at the Glavenus. The Glavenus can breathe fire and it has a sword for a tail. At some point it figured out that it could breathe fire onto its tail to create a fire sword tail. Furthermore, it has learned to use the combined length of its body and the coil of its tail to perform tail sword EI Jutsu. While a normal monster's move list only needs to consist of moves made to challenge a player character, a fighting game monster's move list needs to contain every tool that their human counterparts would have. What makes this interesting is how they apply their weird anatomy to account for this. What's normally a jab or a sweep for a human might be weirdly different when a monster does it. My favorite example of this is the Mad Messiah Jeddah from Darkstalkers 3. Jeddah has corrosive blood and near instantaneous regeneration, and he uses these two quirks in tandem to creatively mutilate himself to hurt his opponent. His fingers stretch out by the fibers to stab at his enemies. He tears off a piece of his bladed wing to create this spinning saw disc. He cuts off his own head to spray a geyser of blood, while a new one immediately grows back. You'll even notice that these stylish red stripes on his suit are actually just open lacerations that are bleeding. Individually, these attacks do a good job of expressing the extent of Jeddah's madness and the lengths he will go through to defeat his foe, but it's when you put them all together in the sequence of gameplay that it begins to feel like a macabre martial art, one uniquely honed to Jeddah's physiology and abilities. Beyond just animations, some monster characters actually build the experience of being a monster into their gameplay, with moves and systems that encourage you to play like a monster. For example, there's Arakune, whom, may I remind you, is a bag full of bees! Arakune's entire moveset consists of nightmarish transformations and abnormal movement that makes it difficult to predict where he might come from. Fighting against Arakune can sometimes feel like a horror movie, where Arakune is just constantly out of sight, poking at you and prodding you with the goal of filling up this curse gauge. The natural buildup of the curse gauge can act like the buildup of tension, because once that curse gauge is full... Oh! No, not the beast! Not the beast! Ah! Arakune's moves even go one step further when you notice that all of his special moves are named after mathematical concepts, hinting at the scientist that he once was. So when you utilize all of Arakune's tools and do this, you are tapping into the calculated intellect of a genius lost to madness. There's a consistent pattern when it comes to stories about monsters. Whether they are ancient myths, cultural folklore, or modern horror, monsters always have the upper hand, and humans always struggle to fight back. Even in stories where a human hero prevails, it is shown to require exceptional cleverness, courage, or sheer grit, because fighting a monster is never a fair fight. This is why I think playing as a monster in a video game is such a special occasion, because being a monster means being something more than human. If fighting game characters typically set a superhuman standard, a fighting game monster needs to go beyond that. Faster than fast, tougher than tough, bigger than big, weirder than weird. A fighter might be exceptional, but a monster crosses that line into incomprehensible, where rules of engagement no longer apply and martial technique no longer works. And when you play a monster well, you may just tap into that ancient primordial fear, the terror of staring into a predator's fangs and knowing that being human just isn't enough. That's all for today's Style Select. I hope you're all having a happy Halloween, so be sure to give this video a like and leave a comment with your thoughts about fighting game monsters. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more content from Sugar Punch. Our channel is supported by our amazing patrons on Patreon, so be sure to check that out if you want early access to future videos and to vote on future episodes of Style Select. I may be I, and happy Halloween, everyone.